Good afternoon, Year 9. First of all, I want to say well done to those that have handed in some fantastic work via Show My Homework. Those that have not done the work can use this opportunity to pause in certain sections, make notes, go over the worksheets that have been set out. This will focus on weeks 1 and 2, so Henry II, the Angevin Empire, and King John. For those of you that have done the work, you can still use this as an opportunity to recap, refresh, go over what you've done, anything that you were stuck on the first time round to help with certain areas that you found challenging. Now, before we look at Henry II and the Angevin Empire, we need to take a bit of a step back and just see what England was like before then. So we need to go back to 1066 and look at the main contenders for the throne. You may be familiar with this worksheet that's on your screen now. If you are not, you may remember back to year 7 when we looked at 1066 and the Battle of Hastings and all those events that may or may not be familiar. Let's have a look at the top left-hand box. Who were the main contenders for the throne in 1066? Well, do we remember William of Normandy, Harald Hardrada, Harold Godwinson? Why did each of these people believe that they were entitled to the throne? Well, William, he claimed that the king before him, Edward the Confessor, had named him to be heir to the throne. Harold Godwinson believed the same, although he went back on his promise to support William as new king because he claimed that Edward the Confessor on his deathbed had promised Harold the kingdom. Harald Hardrada was Norwegian, and so therefore he was a descendant of Vikings, and many people of Viking descent in the north were likely to support him. Do we remember the key battles that were fought? Well, we had the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which Harold Godwinson won. He then had to go and march his troops down to the south, all battered, bruised. Some had been killed in battle. And he had to then face William of Normandy at the Battle of Hastings. So what problems did William face once he had beaten Harold? Remember the arrow, according to the Bayeux Tapestry, went into his eye. Well, he was a French king and the Normans spoke French. They didn't really speak English. So to get the support of the nobles and the people of England, the Anglo-Saxons, would have been very, very difficult at the time. There was always threat, therefore, of rebellion. And if we look at the top right-hand corner, well, Motte and Bailey castles were built to help defend England. They were not very strong. They were made of wood. They could easily catch fire. They could be built quickly. Also, to hold on to his kingdom, where there were rebels in the north, they destroyed many towns and villages to suppress the rebellions. So more than 100,000 people died. This was known as the harrowing of the north. So how did England change under Norman rule? So the creation of the feudal system, where you've got the king at the top, you've got the barons, dukes and earls just below the king. Below that, you've got the knights, and at the bottom, you've got about 1.5 million peasants. So England had a very small population in that time. The Domesday Book recorded everyone who lived in England to calculate how much tax they would owe to the king. So how and why did the Angevins take power in England? Well, first of all, 1066, William of Normandy successfully invaded and conquered England. When he died, he left Normandy and England to his 2 oldest sons. Remember, Normandy is in northern France. William of Normandy was a French king. He had invaded from France. And in 1106, his 3rd and youngest son, Henry I, united the 2 territories under his control. So England and a large section of France becomes part of this kind of English empire. Okay, it's the first notable time that England has an empire. It's very different to the British Empire that is built later on from the 1500s onwards. Henry's only son died in a shipwreck, and he had to name his daughter Matilda as his successor. Well, you can see the problems here. You remember the problems that Elizabeth I has a few hundred years later, being a female ruler. She was challenged for the English crown by her cousin Stephen, and there was a civil war known as the Anarchy. So before Henry died, he secured an important marriage for Matilda to Geoffrey. So marrying this, the count, this aristocrat from France, created a stronger alliance. It strengthened Matilda's position. And in 1154, Henry II was, the son of Matilda and Geoffrey, became the first Angevin king of England. He also ruled the French territories, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. Feel free to pause the video here for a closer look at Henry's family tree. So just to recap, Henry died in 1189. Okay, so he's the first king of the Angevin Empire. Richard I, Henry's son, becomes king of England. In 1199, when Richard I dies, his younger brother John becomes the new king. Now, as you would have seen if you had done the work, there were all sorts of problems with King John. We will have a look at them now. Those of you can use this opportunity to refresh your memory. Those that haven't done the work, make notes. Let's start by making a comparison between the Angevin Empire before the reign of King John and after the reign of King John. Look at what's happened to the English control. Look at what's happened to the French control. What does this suggest about King John's reign of England during this time, during a period of only 16 years? There are many different interpretations of King John, none more so famous than this one.
See, oh, yes, the next stop is Nottingham, sire. Oh, the richest plum of them all, Notting. Ham. Perfect fit, sire. Most becoming. Look real, dignified, sincere, masterful, noble, chivalrous. Don't overdo it. Here's there. That, I believe, does it? This crown gives me a feeling of power! Power! Forgive me a cruel chuckle. Power. And how well King Richard's crown sits on your noble brow. Doesn't it? A King Richard? I told you never to mention my brother's name. Yes, before tongue, Your Majesty.
In the Disney film Robin Hood, both King Richard and King John are portrayed as lions. Notice in that clip that John is shown to be very vain. The crown doesn't quite fit John's head, suggesting that he wasn't the rightful king. He's also shown as vain and obsessed with himself. The story about Robin Hood, he steals from the rich to give to the poor. In the Disney film, he steals from the rich, especially King John, because King John has taxed the people of Nottingham and has used their money for his own self, for his own jewellery, for his own army, for his own wars. So in 1215, the barons rebel against King John for a number of reasons. Firstly, John is thought to have murdered his nephew Arthur. You will see where Arthur is in that family tree that I showed you earlier on in the lesson. Many barons had wanted Arthur to become king rather than John. They did not trust John as they believed he had committed such an evil act. In 1214, King John and the Emperor of Germany attacked France. They lost the Battle of Bouvines, which meant John could not regain the land in France. Remember, all that money gained from the taxation basically went on this war. It went on for John to build his army, and it failed. John lost most of his empire in France. He was looked upon as not being strong in wars, so therefore he got the nickname Soft Sword. The Magna Carta was signed in 1215. The barons hoped it would limit the king's power and would not allow him to rule without consenting them. He ignored the rules of the Magna Carta and objected to Clause 61. Now, the Magna Carta is very important because it is the first time in English history that a set of rules have been drawn up to tell the king what he can and cannot do, how he can behave. Before the Magna Carta, there was nothing really that limited the king's power. So it's very, very important. It was signed in 1215, and as I say, King John went against it. Okay, so that's another reason for the barons to become angry. John also quarrelled with the Pope over the new Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope's choice was Stephen Langton, whom John did not like. And finally, we look at the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was a series of conflicts that took place actually over 116 years. The reason for this long and bloody battle was for England to try and get back the land that they had lost to France. That clip depicts the Battle of Agincourt, one of the most important battles, not only during the 100 Years' War, but in England's history, and is believed to have shaped England's and also France's identity. That's something you want to bear in mind, because that could quite possibly come up as an exam question. So let's look at the causes of the war. So in 1327, when Edward III was crowned king, he realised the kingdom had lost its prestige. His focus was to restore English lands in France. War did not break out until 1337, so 10 years into Edward's rule. So first of all, England controlled Gascony in France. Wine was produced here and shipped to England, where it was taxed. France wanted to take over this region. We can see why. Okay, it would have been very lucrative. It would have made France a lot of money. They would have seen it as rightfully theirs because it was, geographically within their territory. England sold wool abroad. So Flanders was one area that frequently bought English wool to turn into cloth. France now threatened to take over Flanders. This would stop the woolen trade. So can we see how there is conflict for different land? Gascony, Flanders. Edward was closely linked to France. His grandfather was King of France. His mother was the daughter of a French king. Edward believed he had a stronger claim to the throne than the current French king, Philip VI. Edward was in conflict also with Scotland at the time. The French promised to help the Scots, and this made Edward furious. Now, at this point, during our normal scheduled lesson in the classroom, I would ask people to think what they think is the most important cause. If you need time just to pause the video to have a think about that, then obviously please do so. So we're going to go through a brief summary of what happened in the 100 Years' War, and we're going to look at it, we're going to frame the past in order of monarchs. So let's have a look what happened under Edward III. So first of all, Edward II married Queen Isabella of France, was deeply unpopular. Many of his barons were poised to rebel against him because of his weak leadership. So Edward II was hanging on desperately to England's last possession in France, the Duchy of Aquitaine. So his son was Edward III, and as I mentioned earlier, he was crowned in 1327. He realised the kingdom had lost a great deal of its prestige. Edward III claimed that the French crown was his by right, since he was the grandson of Philip. Edward was determined to claim the French crown, and in 1346 sailed to Normandy with an army of 15,000 men. He was met at Crécy by Philip, the only nephew of Philip IV. The Battle of Crécy was a stunning victory for the English. Edward had chosen the perfect location for his archers to devastate the French cavalry being soldiers on horseback, with their longbows. Edward also used cannons to disrupt the French advances. The key outcome of the Battle of Crécy was that the French could not come to the defence of Calais, which would remain in British hands for the next 200 years. Let's have a look at the second main leader here. Okay, so Edward the Black Prince, the son of Edward III. So he led the English to a spectacular victory at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. The French King John and his son were both captured during a humiliating loss for the French. The English continued to use longbow with devastating effects. The French improved their armour, but the Black Prince told them to aim their arrows at the horses instead. The French cavalry collapsed, and the English infantry, the soldiers on foot, massacred the immobile knights whose horse lay dead beneath them. So in the last section of the war, we have got the third monarch. So in 1413, the Black Prince's great-grandson, Henry V, began plans for an invasion of France almost immediately after being crowned to reclaim his family's dynastic lands. Henry was a brave, military, experienced king who at 29 years old, had an army of 6,000 men across the English Channel. In October, he marched towards Calais and recaptured this strategic town. An enormous army intercepted Henry's, and the two forces faced off in the village of Agincourt. So this leads us then into the most famous battle of the 100 Years' War, and something that is still commemorated. There are many reenactments that take place on an annual basis to celebrate this particular battle. As I say, it shaped English and French identity in the centuries to come. The French army totaled 24,000. 10,000 of them were knights, 10,000 lightly armed soldiers, and a mixture of 4,000 crossbowmen, archers, and infantrymen. Although the odds were against Henry, because Henry's army was vastly outnumbered, his skills as a battlefield commander proved decisive, as he kept his men at a distance from the French army. So the Battle of Agincourt has been seen as a significant victory for the English. This was a famous victory by an English army led by the first King of England to speak and write in English since the Norman conquest. It gave the English a sense of destiny and played a role in shaping English identity in the centuries to come. So apart from these iconic leaders and some of these most memorable events and battles that took place in those 116 years, what precisely did the 100 Years' War achieve for England? Well, precisely nothing. If we have a brief look at the timeline of the 100 Years' War, let's have a look. When the 100 Years' War is believed to have started in 1337, have a look at that map. So the sort of orangey colour represents the French territory. As you can see, most of that territory belongs to France, with a little tiny kind of green strip here that represents England. So this is what England hold. Remember, a couple of hundred years before, England had held the majority of this, but they had lost it. So they embarked on a 100 Years' War to try and get it back again. It starts to work by 1360. Look how much the English have gained, this green territory here. By 1429, well, England have lost some territory, but they've gained some more in the north. So what's happening so far is that the English are winning battles, they are losing battles, they are gaining, they are lost, they are losing, the French are gaining, the French are losing. And what happens by the end? Well, I was going to say we're back where we started, but we're not, because the English have practically disappeared from that French region completely. Just before we go, let's have a very quick look at those answers to the questions, the quiz that you was given at the end of one of your sheets. And the quiz was on Elizabeth I. So this will give you a chance to check your answers. If you have not had a go at this, have a quick go now. pause it before I reveal the answers. If I reveal the answers now, you then have a chance to check how many you got correct. Okay, I hope you found this useful, Year 9. I hope to make another video based on the work that you are currently doing, and so we can have a catch up again soon. In the meantime, stay safe and stay healthy.